When I was studying photography, I absolutely fought against it. I never took anything as a given. I always challenged, and so it's definitely a love-hate relationship. I'm forever intrigued by it, but I am also, on the flip side, really irritated by potentially so many people using it as a given, that there's just conventions that are already existing, that they're not ever challenged. So Make Love to the Camera is a body of work where I've kind of collated lots of diagrams or schematic representations found within photography manuals. I have one here. This is a photographic manual dating probably from the 70s, 80s, The Art of Portraits and the Nude. And it's one of many I have. And within photo manuals, there's always this section on the nude. It wasn't necessarily the photographic images that struck me as, because they were kind of glamour, but the diagrams were curious because they positioned the lady or the female subject very crudely, but the photographic equipment surrounding her was much more detailed. So there was two sort of fetishizations happening within these diagrams. I have a push love-hate relationship with the photographic world. I think it's quite conservative at times, or I find that the dialogue around photography can be very obsessed by representation and what is contained within the image, rather than all the other stuff, the detritus, the mechanism. And so I think for me, I kind of position myself outside of that.
And I always start from the premise that there's something interesting here, and maybe I'm not getting it. I think that's a good place to start with. But you have to, with conceptualism, you have to sort of dig deep, and you have to expect a degree of bafflement from the readers. You do get a lot of, particularly with the online world, you do get a lot of flack now. Conceptual photography is one thing guaranteed: to get people posting abusive comments about you. If you write anything positive about it, it's terrible. So it must be doing something right, I think.
The most important things about contemporary art photography is that anyone can walk into the gallery and say, oh, it's a man with a hyena on a leash. It's a petrol station. It's a woman who's just had a baby. And they can recognize that content, but they don't necessarily have any access to the ideas, the motivations, the historical references, the intertextuality, all the rich layering of ideas and concepts that may be going on in that work may require a little more legwork to understand. So I think the term conceptual photography is useful insofar as it might give an indication to that kind of lay person that there is more there that might be worth pursuing.
The whole term conceptual photography is actually quite derogatory to other types of photographic making, because it assumes that if you are making something in terms of a documentary, that you're not thinking, that you're not researching, that it's not questioning what is within the image and what's outside of the image. So I think it's a problematic term in terms of I think and you don't think, or this type of maker thinks and that one doesn't.
looking back at that moment, or let's say the 1970s in conceptual art, there was a certain trend, I think, among my generation to want to, one, there was this kind of return to making things in the studio, but on the other hand, there was an impulse to bring emotion back into a conceptual practice, that in fact they weren't divorced from one another, they were they could be integrated. And so I guess recently I was just thinking of Dutch artist, this Bas-Jan Adder, who really made incredibly emotional, sad, conceptual photographic works, part performance, part documentary photographs, but quite sentimental even, I guess. And anyway, so for me, it was, I was trying to address different human things without being, at this point, autobiographical, without being, confessional in the way a lot of narrative photography of the 70s became.
There was a fear that in using photography, the means and ends of photography would be subsumed under what we might call a humanist discourse. That humanist discourse that tended to dominate a lot of photographic criticism of the time, be it modernist or even anti-modernist. So there was a general resistance on the part of that generation of artists using photography, again that's the important distinction, to subvert those connections.
The generation of artist photographers who really picked up the conceptual banner in the 1970s, people like Victor Bergen or Alan Sekula, were people who were sort of the most critical of capitalism and its elitism and its trappings. Yet the seriousness that they brought to photography has contributed enormously to it becoming a valued market and institutional commodity.
And at some point in the 80s, I think, when conceptual photography kind of started to creep up there with conceptual art, it became the thing that the market wanted. It became the thing that a lot of well-known galleries, a lot of the Venice Biennale, Documenta, it all became about conceptualism, at the exclusion of many other kinds of photography. And I think Paul Graham, who interestingly you could argue is Paul Graham a conceptualist, who knows, but he wrote a beautiful piece last year. And these things have been banging around in my head, and I was trying to think of a way to, and I read this piece of his called The Unreasonable Apple. I think it was a lecture he gave, and he talked about this very thing, that there was this now hierarchy of values within photography, particularly art photography, and that conceptualism was right at the top. And I actually wouldn't mind reading from it because he says it better than I could. And he talks about reading this review of a Jeff Wall show, and the critic says, carefully constructing his pictures as provocative, often open-ended vignettes instead of just snapping his surroundings. And Paul Graham, as I did, took umbrage with this, this kind of hierarchy of values, that as if going out into the world with the camera and photographing what you see was no longer a valid response. And I think that's wrong. I think it is just as valid a response as having a conceptual process. And it's what brought us Lee Friedlander, it's what brought us Diane Arbus, it's what brought us hundreds of great photographers, Robert Frank. Suddenly, is that all consigned to the dustbin of history because it's not conceptually driven?
Well, this is the thing. I mean, the question is, what were the driving principles of art photography before concept kind of kicked in? And I think the answer to that would be expressive, personal, subjective work that was made as a result of a gut feeling, an impulse, a response of the eye, something maybe poetic or tactile or emotional. And all of these things have been out.
I think work has to have some sort of humanist. It's a dreadful, I can't think of a better word for it, but a humanist thrust. It has to tell us something about how we live, where we live. And that's probably an old-fashioned attitude in this day and age.
Conceptual photography is anti-personal and anti-emotional, anti-subjective. Yeah. We might be beginning to look at contemporary photography, conceptual photography, to be important or interesting or valuable to us in different ways. We might be looking for different kinds of value, different values. So mere complexity, complexity on its own, has become a value. So, as has ambiguity, in a way, just something that oscillates, refusing to have its meaning pinned down. That in itself has become perhaps a value rather than a weakness.
Yeah, I really don't see it as my job to be super clear, or maybe it's good that there's a question or a puzzle or a difficulty.
My issue sometimes with conceptualism is that the idea overrides everything else. So what you see when you stand in the gallery, I mean, to me, to be quite honest, I'm not that interested in the process or how you got to that image. I'm walking into a gallery, I'm looking at the image. Does the image engage me? All the invisible stuff that happened beforehand, unless you've got a huge text on the wall telling me what it is, which might point to the fact that photography is not really speaking for itself.
Most early conceptual art was quite dumb and upfront about what it was doing, and while it might have puns built into it, it might be a little bit layered. It wasn't like withholding what it was that it was doing. It was deliberately quite obvious. And I think it's a real difference in contemporary work that that the idea may be obvious, but the idea, it's actually much more common now for the idea to be held back.
Photography is a really interesting medium in terms of giving us a perspective, one way of looking at something. There's not multiple ways. It's not that you can skirt around and see beyond or the side of an object. You're given one point of view, and that point of view can sometimes be deceptive. I'm quite interested in photography's power to just home in on one way of seeing. Particularly within this, there is no kind of understood reference points. Even the horizon lines are skew. That a form, you're not sure if it's a form or a reflection of a form or a ground. And that ambiguity, I think, is quite interesting. But I'm not so sure that it's about working it out, because I think with some of them, you can never work it out. It's impossible. Even I find it difficult, and I was there at the making. And what's interesting is that when you shoot, I'm shooting a number of images, and I'm seeing in a way, and I'm shooting, and suddenly I see the object in a totally different way. And there's a trompe-l'oeil effect, or there's a shift of perspective or deception. There's an illusion that kind of happens at a particular viewpoint. And I'm adept at getting it now quicker than I was at the start of the work. And when it surprises me, when I can't work it out visually, that's when I think I've got something interesting.